most terrifying sound on a battlefield is not an explosion. It is silence. Not the quiet before an ambush. Not the calm of night. This is a deeper silence. Mechanical. Final. The moment when a 30-ton steel predator coughs once and then stops breathing. Inside the tank, everything dies at once. The engine sputters, chokes, and goes still. The turret freezes mid-turn, the hydraulic whine collapsing into nothing. The radio crackles one last time and dissolves into static. The heater cuts out. The smell of oil and sweat turns cold. In the space of a heartbeat, a machine built to kill becomes a steel coffin, stranded in the mud, waiting for someone else to decide how it ends. The crews have a name for it. They don't put it in manuals. They don't write it in after-action reports. They call it the dry death. Not killed by shells, not burned by flamethrowers, just empty, out of fuel. A tank without gasoline is not a weapon. It is a monument to bad timing. And in late summer of 1944, the dry death was claiming more American tanks than German guns ever could. After Normandy, the U.S. Army was moving fast. Too fast, some would say. Roads that had never seen more than horse carts were suddenly grinding under columns of armor. Towns fell in days instead of weeks. Maps were being redrawn faster than printers could keep up. It felt like momentum. It felt like victory. But momentum has a diet. And armored divisions are always hungry. A single U.S. armored division drank gasoline the way a wildfire drinks oxygen. Tens of thousands of gallons a day. Every mile forward burned fuel, not just in tanks, but in trucks, jeeps, generators, ambulances, radios. Steel doesn't move on courage. It moves on chemistry. The problem wasn't that America didn't have fuel. The problem was distance. As the front raced east, supply lines stretched west like rubber bands pulled to their limit. And then came the rain. European rain. Cold, steady, merciless. It turned roads into swamps and fields into traps. Tires disappeared to the axles. Tracks spun uselessly. The veins carrying the Army's lifeblood clogged with mud. At a forward logistics depot near the Belgian border, the offensive slowed not because of enemy fire, but because of gravity. Trucks sank. Wheels drowned. Hope stalled. Inside a canvas command tent, the air smelled of wet wool mud and cigar smoke. A desk lamp buzzed quietly. Papers were stacked neatly clipped aligned. Captain Arthur Sterling stood behind that desk like he had been issued with it. His uniform was pressed, his boots clean, his hands untouched by grease or rain. Sterling was not a villain. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He was careful. And in the Army, careful men survive long careers. Standing across from him was a tank commander pulled straight from the line. His jacket was soaked. His face was streaked with grime. His eyes were bloodshot, the look of a man who had slept in minutes instead of hours. Captain the tanker said, his voice rough, "My platoon is 3 miles past the ridge. We're dry. Engines are dead. If we don't get fuel by nightfall, we abandon the tanks." Sterling didn't look up right away. He adjusted his glasses. He sighed. Not in anger. In inconvenience. "Sergeant," he said calmly, "look outside." The tanker turned. Beyond the tent flap, trucks sat half buried in brown sludge. Mud clung to everything. It swallowed boots. It swallowed tires. It swallowed patience. "My heavy transports weigh over 10 tons when loaded," Sterling continued. "If I send them out on those roads, they sink. Then I lose the trucks and the fuel. That helps no one. So we just die," the tanker snapped. Sterling finally looked up. His eyes weren't cruel. They were tired. "My responsibility," he said, "is to preserve Army assets. I cannot authorize a convoy until engineers stabilize the route. That is procedure. Procedure." The word hung in the air like incense in a church. Sacred. Untouchable. The tanker stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out into the rain without another word. Sterling watched him go. He straightened a paper on his desk. In his world, rules existed to prevent disaster, and breaking them was how disasters started. Outside, leaning against the corrugated wall of a maintenance shed, someone else had heard every word. Technical Sergeant Jack Sullivan flicked open a lighter shielding the flame from the rain with hands permanently stained by oil. He took a drag and exhaled slowly, watching the tanker disappear into the mud. Jack was in his 40s, Detroit-born. 20 years on factory floors before the Army decided it needed his hands more than his opinions. He wasn't built for speeches, he was built for broken things. He looked past the bogged-down GMC trucks. Too heavy, too proud. Dinosaurs stuck in a tar pit. A young private stood beside him, shivering in a jacket 2 sizes too big. Tommy Miller, 19. Fresh from Kansas. Still believed manuals told the truth. "They're just going to leave him out there?" Tommy asked. Jack didn't answer right away. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, battered photograph. A little girl with a missing front tooth smiled back at him. Lily, his daughter, the only thing in his life he kept clean. "If the tanks stop," Jack said quietly, "the war stops. And if the war stops, I don't go home." He slipped the photo back into his pocket and looked across the yard again, past the big trucks, past the jeeps that couldn't carry enough fuel to matter. And then he saw it. A small, unimpressive truck parked off to the side. Light frame, narrow tires, designed to haul laundry, not glory. The kind of vehicle officers walked past without seeing. Jack's mouth curled into a thin smile. Not a happy one. The kind that comes when a man realizes the rule book has been asking the wrong question. The problem wasn't that they didn't have trucks. The problem was that they were using the wrong ones. Behind him, thunder rolled low on the horizon. Or maybe it was artillery. In 1944, France, the two often sounded the same. Jack pushed off the wall and stepped into the rain. Somewhere out there, steel monsters sat silent. And silence on a battlefield never stayed quiet for long. Jack didn't rush. He never did. Rushing was how bolts snapped and engines caught fire. He stood at the edge of the motor pool, rain tapping on his helmet eyes, moving the way a mechanic's eyes always move. Slow, methodical, unimpressed by size or rank. The big GMC truck sat first in his line of sight. Heavy, proud. Built to carry half the war on their backs. Right now they were sunk to their axles like beached whales. 10 tons of confidence, defeated by mud that didn't care about paperwork. He shifted his gaze to the jeeps. Clean, nimble, fast. Too fast, actually. They could zip through the muck, sure, but they carried about as much fuel as a good idea and a prayer. You could refuel a lawnmower with that, not a Sherman. Jack exhaled smoke and let it drift into the rain. The Army loved extremes. Big solutions or tiny ones, nothing in between. Then he saw it. Off to the side, half forgotten, was a small utility truck. Narrow tires, light frame, the kind of vehicle no one saluted. The kind no one bragged about in letters home. It looked more like it belonged on a farm road than a battlefield. Jack walked toward it slowly, boots squelching. He kicked one tire. It didn't sink. Not much, anyway. Too small, someone would say. Not armored, another would add. Against regulations, a third would shout. Jack smiled thinly. Regulations didn't know mud. Mud didn't care about armor. Mud only cared about weight. He ran a hand along the truck's side, feeling the thin steel. Light meant pressure spread out. Pressure spread out meant traction. Traction meant movement. And movement meant fuel where it mattered. Tommy appeared beside him, wide-eyed. "That's that thing?" he asked. "Jack, that's a laundry truck." "Exactly," Jack muttered. "Laundry doesn't like getting stuck." Tommy frowned. "It doesn't have a fuel tank big enough, or a pump, or, well, anything useful." Jack nodded. "Right now, no. But metal doesn't care what it used to be." He looked back at the bogged-down giants behind them, then at the silent horizon, where tanks were waiting to die politely, engines cold. The idea formed the way bad ideas always do. Quietly. Completely. With no concern for consequences. They didn't need a better road. They didn't need permission. They needed something light enough to float over the problem. Jack flicked his cigarette into the mud. "If we can't bring the fuel with the trucks we have," he said more to himself than to Tommy, "we build the truck the fuel needs." Tommy swallowed. "That sounds dangerous." Jack opened the driver's door and looked inside. "Yeah," he said. "That's how you know it might work." The rain didn't stop. It never did. It just changed tempo like a bad drummer who only knew one song. Water drummed against the tin roof of the maintenance shed as Jack closed the door with his shoulder and looked at the truck one more time. No speeches, no hesitation. Just work. "First rule," Jack muttered. "Grabbing a wrench, nothing sacred." The wooden cargo bed came off first. Bolts screamed. Wood cracked. What had once carried laundry and crates splintered onto the floor in useless pieces. Tommy winced every time something broke. Jack didn't. You couldn't build something new without killing the old version first. They stripped the frame down to bare steel and stared at it in silence. It looked thin. Too thin. The kind of thin that made officers nervous and mechanics thoughtful. "She's gonna sag," Tommy said. "Everything sags," Jack replied. "You just decide where." They reinforced the frame with scavenged steel ugly welds, layered on top of older, uglier welds. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't regulation, but it would hold, probably. Jack trusted metal more than doctrine. Then came the drums. 4 standard steel barrels, dented, scratched, smelling faintly of whatever they'd carried before. Gasoline was picky like that. It remembered everything. Jack lined them up and began welding them together into a single reservoir. No baffles, no internal walls. Just one long steel belly full of sloshing danger. Tommy swallowed. "That stuff's gonna move," he said. "Oh, it'll move," Jack answered, without looking up. That's the problem. Sparks flew bright and violent against the gray rainlight. One bad pocket of fumes, and the shed would disappear in a flash. Jack knew it. Tommy knew it. They worked anyway because knowing the risk didn't make the tanks out there any less empty. A container was useless without a way to empty it fast. Jack wiped his hands and crouched under the truck, tapping the transmission housing with his knuckles. "See this," he said. "Power takeoff. Designed to run farm equipment. Winches. Pumps." Tommy blinked. "You're not serious." "I never joke about moving liquids," Jack said. "Liquids don't forgive." They bolted a salvaged pump to the frame, crude and heavy, and rigged a shaft straight from the transmission. When the engine turned, the pump would turn. Simple. Brutal. Effective. On paper, it was insane. In the mud, it was elegant. Jack stood back and looked at their creation. A light truck carrying a heavy sin. No armor. No safety margins. No second chances. Tommy's voice shook. If this thing goes up, we won't feel it, Jack finished calmly, which is comforting if you think about it. The engine coughed when they turned the key, then settled into a steady rhythm. The pump screamed as it engaged a sound halfway between progress and a warning. Jack nodded once. "She'll work," he said. Not because it was safe, not because it was but because there was nothing else left that could. They didn't call it a test run. That would have implied planning. This was a shakedown, the kind where you learn the truth by letting physics speak first. The truck lurched out of the shed and onto a logging road that had once pretended to be solid ground. Rain slicked the mud into something between soup and betrayal. Jack sat in the passenger seat, eyes forward, hands resting like he was listening to an engine talk. Tommy drove stiff-backed knuckles white, trying to be gentle with something that had no interest in being treated gently. At first it worked. The light truck skimmed where the heavy ones had drowned. Tires bit. The engine hummed. For a brief, dangerous moment, it felt like they'd beaten the problem. Then the road dipped. Tommy saw the crater late and did what every farm kid is taught to do. He hit the brakes. Hard. Behind them, 400 gallons of gasoline did what liquid always does when you ask it to obey. It didn't. It surged forward in one violent wave, slamming into the front of the welded tank like a hammer. The rear of the truck lifted. Tires lost their grip. The world tilted. It's called the free surface effect. Sailors fear it. Tanker drivers respect it. Anyone who ignores it ends up upside down. The truck didn't stop. It slid. Sideways, fast. An oak tree filled the windshield. Off the brake, Jack shouted, already moving. He drove his elbow into Tommy's ribs, knocking the kid's foot free. He grabbed the wheel and turned into the slide, not fighting the fuel, but letting it finish its tantrum. The gasoline crashed back metal, ringing like a bell struck too hard. The suspension bottomed out. The truck balanced for a heartbeat on the edge of catastrophe, then slammed back into the mud, missing the tree by feet that felt like inches. Silence flooded the cab. Not the good kind. The kind that waits to see if you're still alive. Tommy shook. I stopped, like you said. That's the problem, Jack replied, breathing steady. He lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. Crates stay put. Liquid remembers where it was and wants to go back there. He stared ahead, imprinting the lesson into muscle memory. You don't fight it, you lead it. Brake early, turn wide, smooth inputs. You feel the wave before it hits. If you argue with it, it kills you. Tommy nodded, swallowing hard. Jack reached over and took the wheel. Physics doesn't care about bravery, he said, easing the truck forward. It doesn't care about rank either. Learn its rules or it writes your obituary. The truck rolled on slower now. Wiser. Still dangerous. They hadn't met the Germans yet. But they'd already found an enemy far less forgiving. They didn't make it far. The headlights washed over the depot gate, and the truck rolled to a stop under a pair of raised rifles and one very irritated voice. Captain Sterling stepped out of the shadows, clipboard tucked under his arm like a shield. Behind him, 2 military policemen stood, stiff fingers close to triggers, doing exactly what the Army had trained them to do: obey. Sterling took one look at the truck and winced. The welded drums, the sagging frame, the hose coiled like a sleeping snake. What in God's name is that, he asked. Jack killed the engine. Silence rushed in. A solution, he said. Sterling shook his head slowly. It's a violation of about a dozen regulations I can name without looking. It's unsafe, and you are not taking it anywhere. Tommy swallowed. Jack stayed still. Captain Jack replied, voice level. Those tanks out there are dry. Engines dead. Crews waiting. Every minute you stand here talking is a minute closer to abandoned armor. Sterling tapped the clipboard. And every minute this thing sits running is a minute closer to an explosion. You want to kill half the depot with your improvisation. One of the MPs shifted his weight uneasy now that he'd actually looked at the truck. Gasoline had a smell, and this one reeked of it. If you shoot the tire, Jack said calmly, nodding toward the rifle, the spark won't ask whose side you're on. The MP hesitated. He didn't lower the weapon, but he didn't raise it either. Sterling's jaw tightened. You're asking me to ignore procedure. No, Jack said. I'm asking you to accept reality. Rain ran down the captain's helmet. He looked past Jack, past the truck, toward the dark horizon, where distant flashes marked men still fighting. For a moment, the clipboard felt heavier than it should have. If that thing goes up, Sterling said quietly, it's on you. Jack nodded. Always was. Sterling stepped aside. Just enough to clear the gate. He didn't salute. He didn't sign anything. He simply turned his back. Go, he said, before I change my mind. The MPs lowered their rifles. The engine roared back to life. As the truck rolled past, Sterling didn't look at it again. He hadn't approved the mission. He hadn't stopped it either. And in war, that gray space is where most decisions actually live. They killed the headlights the moment they left the last friendly checkpoint. The road didn't disappear. It shrank, reduced to a thin ribbon of darker black cutting through darker trees. Jack drove with the kind of restraint that came from understanding how little forgiveness the night had left. No sudden throttle, no hard turns, just enough motion to stay alive. The truck felt different out here, lighter, exposed. Every sound traveled farther. The pump ticked softly behind them like a reminder that they were sitting on a very patient bomb. Tommy whispered, "We're past the line." "I know," Jack replied, just as quiet. "That's why I'm not singing." They rolled forward on marker lights, only two faint slits barely kissing the ground. Ahead, the forest breathed. Somewhere in the dark, engines moved. Not American ones. Jack felt it before he heard it. A low diesel growl. Slower, heavier, wrong. He eased off the throttle. The truck coasted. A shape emerged between the trees. Steel, tracks. A turret cutting a careful arc through the night. A German tank sitting broadside to the road, like it owned the darkness. They stopped. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. The enemy tank idled its engine, coughing rhythmically like a predator, deciding whether something was worth killing. The spotlight snapped on. White light washed over the truck, over the skinny tires, over the welded drums stacked like a mistake no one would make on purpose. The beam lingered. Jack didn't move. He didn't breathe. He knew what the German commander was seeing. Not a threat, not a convoy, just a confused shape, a farm truck, scrap, something that didn't belong here and therefore couldn't be dangerous. The turret twitched, hesitated. "That's it," Jack murmured. "He doesn't believe us." The spotlight drifted away. Jack didn't wait for permission from fate. He buried the throttle. The truck leapt forward, light and angry, crashing off the road into the undergrowth. Branches exploded against the cab. The suspension screamed. Behind them, the German tank reacted too late. Machine gun fire tore through the darkness, tracers ripping through the space they'd occupied a second earlier. The heavy tank tried to turn tracks grinding, but mass is a terrible thing when you need to be quick. The little truck danced. It slid through gaps too narrow for steel giants, bounced over roots, skidded back onto a dirt track, and kept going. Only when the gunfire faded did Jack slow. Tommy laughed, once sharp and disbelieving. They hadn't beaten the enemy with armor or firepower. They'd beaten him by being light, strange, and unbelievable. Sometimes survival isn't about being stronger. It's about not making sense fast enough to be shot. The clearing appeared suddenly, like a wound torn open in the forest. 3 Sherman sat there, dark and silent, angled into a defensive triangle. No engines, no movement. Just steel shapes waiting for dawn or death, whichever arrived first. Jack didn't slow until he was right on top of them. "Halt here," he said. "Close, real close." Tommy jumped down and ran for the pump boots sliding in the mud. Jack grabbed the hose and climbed onto the back deck of the lead Sherman. The metal was cold. Too cold. He popped the fuel cap and shoved the nozzle in. Pump on. The engine note changed as the PTO engaged. The pump screamed high, sharp, impossible to hide. Fuel surged through the hose. The tank drank greedily. From the tree-line muzzle flashes bloomed. Rounds snapped into the dirt, pinged off armor. A shard of metal tore through the side of the truck. Gasoline began to spill thin and shining, spreading across the mud. "We're leaking!" Tommy yelled. "Keep it running," Jack shouted back. "We're not done." He didn't let go of the nozzle. If he did, the pressure would spray fuel everywhere. Over hot metal. Over engines that were about to wake up angry. The infantry fire grew closer. Jack felt the air move as rounds passed. He hunched over the hose, using his body as a shield, fully aware of how ridiculous that was. Then the sound changed. A deeper engine note. Diesel. Heavy. Wrong. Jack looked up just in time to see it pushing through the trees. A Panzer. Turret already lowering. "How much?" Jack yelled. Almost there, Tommy's screamed eyes locked on the gauge. The Panzer stopped, took aim. Now Jack roared. He ripped the nozzle free. Gas splashed over his sleeves. He jumped clear as the Sherman's engine coughed once, twice, and then came alive. The turret spun faster than the German gunner expected. The 70 millimeter barked once. The shell struck true. The Panzer vanished in fire and noise. The clearing filled with heat and light. Jack lay flat in the mud, heart hammering, covered in fuel smoke and blood he didn't have time to identify. Around him, engines roared. The other Shermans were waking up now, fueled just enough to move to fight to matter again. Tommy laughed, half hysterical. Jack pushed himself up, shaking. They hadn't delivered a convoy. They delivered seconds. And sometimes in war, seconds are enough to change everything. The truck limped home at dawn. It didn't roll in like a hero. It crawled. The frame sagged. One headlight was gone. The pump dripped fuel in a thin, embarrassed line, like it knew it had overstayed its welcome. Mud coated everything. Smoke clung to the steel. Jack killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking metal cool down. That sound meant you were alive. Tommy fell asleep where he sat, helmet tilted forward, rifle hugged like a pillow. He looked older than he had the night before. Not wiser, just heavier. Officers gathered slowly. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout. They stared at the truck, then at the men, then at the mud still wet with gasoline and blood. Someone asked for a report. Someone else asked if the vehicle could be repaired. Jack didn't answer either question. A senior officer finally spoke. He didn't mention regulations. He didn't mention discipline. He said the 4th Armored was moving again. He said the line held. He said the tanks were alive. No medals appeared, no photographers, no speeches about bravery. The truck was written off. Too damaged, too dangerous. It would be stripped for parts and forgotten by noon. Jack didn't argue. He patted the hood once like you'd pat a tired horse and walked away. History would remember the generals. It always does. It would remember the tanks, the guns, the victories drawn in clean lines on maps. It would not remember a mechanic, a scared kid, and a laundry truck filled with gasoline. But wars aren't won by names carved in stone. They're won by the people who keep the machines breathing long enough for someone else to take the credit. Jack pulled a photo from his pocket and wiped a smear of oil from it. The girl was still smiling. "That's enough," he muttered. And for once it was.